And so the first thing I define when I'm going to design a product is I look at what is the purpose of the product? Who are the people who will be using the product? And then after I define that, then we say, okay, what technology really fits best? Because a lot of times people tend to use too high a technology to solve a simple problem. And it just complicates things. The whole idea is the more simple it is, the easier it's going to be for the clinician, the less they have to think about.
I think at one point we thought, oh, gee, well, ultrasonics is just so much easier than hand instrumentation. And I would say it requires the same precision, the same knowledge, the same information of root anatomy, and knowing where you are and what you're doing. So I would say a shorter stroke length, staying in contact with the tooth or, with the calculus, so that that energy transfer is such that it will build up and fracture the calculus off.
A tale of two hygienists.
And welcome back, dental people, to episode 544 with a Tale of Two Hygienists podcast. And we are very excited because we couldn't get enough for last week's episode. So we are talking further with my superheroes, Mr. and Mrs. Ultrasonic, and just tell us a little bit more about their not so secret identity and what we're going to be talking about today.
Well, if you would like to hear a little bit more about how they met and how they became the superheroes that they are, tune into last week's episode where they give us the nitty-gritty and really actually great life advice about how they met and what they do. And today we're going to delve even deeper into what the Paschkes have done for the profession of dental hygiene. And we have with us Noel, who was the first dental hygienist at Johns Hopkins Hospital and the first RDH appointed to the medical school faculty. And today we're going to delve a little deeper about what it means to be a medical provider
Mhm.
as a dental hygienist. And with her is Rich, who is the engineer who makes this medical provider's dreams come true. He has a master's degree in industrial engineering and a bachelor's in physics, which really makes a difference with coming to ultrasonic engineering. So I want to kind of start the conversation about being a medical provider. And as an engineer, Rich, what does being an ultrasonic engineer have to do with getting a medical provider a good device? Like that's kind of the vein I want to go in. So you two tell me a little bit about that connection. So Rich, the engineer side, Noel, the medical provider side.
Sure. Okay, which one do you want to go first?
Well, let's start with you, Noel. Let's do that.
Okay.
You set the stage. Set the stage.
Okay. All right. Fun, fun, fun. So, my first position out of dental hygiene school was to work at the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. And when I was in dental hygiene school at the University of Maryland, we had a rotation to the University of Maryland Hospital. And I joke about it by saying the hospital bug bit me. I was just so fascinated with being able to provide dental hygiene services in the hospital experience. But here was the deal is that there were no positions available. So I thought, well, gee, like what is a famous hospital? What's like the hospitals in the Baltimore area? And I thought, oh, Johns Hopkins. Okay, I'll see if they have a dental hygienist. Well, they didn't. So I wrote the job description. I went to the head of the department, told him how much he needed a dental hygienist because they were opening the bone marrow transplant center. There were only two in the country at the time, one at University of Washington, and then this the bone marrow transplant center at Hopkins. And you think about what we had to work with at that time. We weren't doing salivary diagnostics about specific oral flora, and but what I did learn in dental hygiene school, which was actually 49 years ago, so it tells you how advanced our faculty at the time, how advanced they were, is that we knew that the mouth was connected to the rest of the body, and
Some people
that
don't know that, Noel. Some
yeah,
people don't.
and so that was kind of like this big epiphany, and I did know that, having done some work with people who were undergoing immunosuppressive therapy at the University of Maryland, that they weren't totally suppressed. Where a bone marrow transplant person, they're in their medical history, they're totally immunosuppressed, and got to thinking, oh my gosh, you've got all this bacteria, the plaque in their mouth when they're totally immunosuppressed. What's going to happen? And so I had an idea of, yeah, they're going to spike a fever of unknown origin
Mhm.
and potentially they're going to die. because they just don't have anything to fight it. So really that idea of the medical aspect and the importance of what hygienists provide and it has run through my entire career. So next year I'll be celebrating 50 years, which I don't know where the time went, but it was like in many ways just a blur. But I'm just so thrilled to see that there are more and more hygienists that are engaged in the practice of hospital dental hygiene. It is absolutely fascinating.
I love that. And I love that you saw an opportunity and it didn't exist. So just
No,
recently in the state of Utah, legislation passed that a dental hygienist can now work in a hospital
I
setting,
saw that. I'm so
right?
excited for you.
And but we currently don't have a plan, like we don't have a formal plan of how that happens.
You
So if you're listening to this,
really?
I don't know of a hygienist that works in a hospital setting yet. Like I don't know of one that now works in the hospital system. And I
Mhm.
just want your story to encourage people that you can write a job description, you can meet with people, you can explain to them why a dental hygienist would be an excellent fit in this
Mhm.
medical setting because you are indeed a medical provider, which
Absolutely.
trans yes, and which we're not technicians, and I think
No, we are not.
our instrumentation is reflective of being a medical provider and not a technician.
Mhm.
And it's not just a magic wand. So, Rich, tell us about the nuances of an ultrasonic, why it's a medical device.
Well, firstly, yeah, let me give you a little background. My first job in the dental field was working for a company called Cavitron Corporation. They were located in Long Island City, New York. I had previously come from a defense contract background, and one of my first designs. Well, first, let me talk about how I was interviewed. I was interviewed by a brilliant engineer who had actually worked with Oppenheimer at Los Alamos on the atomic bomb, and he was intrigued with my background and really wanted to have me design a specific product for them. Well, I turned him down 3 times, and the 4th time I came back, I said, "You know what? Maybe I belong in the dental field. It seems like a little more fun thing to do." So one of the first jobs I had was to, make what was called a radio frequency scalpel. It was an electrosurgical device for shaping gums,
Mm.
Mhm.
and I had designed the product, I was working on it and diligently, and my supervisor came to me and said, "Paschke, this is taking way too long. What's the problem?" And I said, "This goes in somebody's mouth."
Hmm.
And he looked at me. He said, "That's kind of ironic. You used to make bombs, didn't you?" And I said, "Well, yeah, but this is a little closer up front."
You're like, "I'd like to preserve life." That's
That's
why I
right.
made the
Yeah.
switch.
Right.
But one of the things I do, as designing medical devices, we talked in the previous session about bottom-up design and the importance of that. I use Stephen Covey's approach, keep the end in mind, or begin with the end
Mhm.
in mind. And so the first thing I define when I'm gonna design a product is I look at what is the purpose of the product? Who are the people who will be using the product? And then after I define that, then we say, okay, what technology really fits best? Because a lot of times people tend to use too high a technology to solve a simple problem. And it just complicates things. The whole idea is the more simple it is, the easier it's going to be for the clinician, the less they have to think about. And so that's part of my design approach. And then once I do that, then I go into the manufacturing part of it. Now, I was fortunate having worked for 30 years with Cavitron to have a lot of different roles. So I was a project engineer. I managed the R&D group. I managed the manufacturing engineering group. My last job there was technology manager, which sounds like a strange title, but basically it was a liaison where I coordinated between the R&D group, marketing, the clinical group, which Noel was managing, and corporate product development. Because one of the most difficult things to do is take a product and get it through the rigors of a corporate approval process without losing what it started out to be. And my experience having worked with all the different products in different departments made that job for me pretty easy.
So I want to know a little bit more about like our everyday uses with our piezos and ultrasonics and cavitations. Like, what's the difference? Do they have frequencies? Tell us, remind me, because I gotta be honest. Like the last time I dug deep into like what an ultrasonic and a piezo was in hygiene school, and I use these things every single day, and I want to be able to kind of like get reacclimated with it and how impactful it is to use it and how safe it is with my patients.
So, Dave, for you, that it sounds like you were very lucky in your dental hygiene program to be exposed to both technologies. So, both piezo and magneto, like Cavitron, they're both ultrasonic. And there are many clinicians that when we were educated, we were only educated on one technology.
Hmm.
And so, hats off to your faculty that you had that exposure of both of the technologies. And so, one of the things that they both share is they both have the quality of they work off of frequency and amplitude. And those words are like, you're like, what are you talking about? The what with the what? But it actually has a clinical application that we'll explain, a little bit later. But I do want to do a shout out for Endeavor because, of course, this is an Endeavor. This podcast is produced through Endeavor, but also through RDH magazine. And so Rich and I, as Mr. and Mrs. Ultrasonics, we've written several articles this year. And one in particular, Dave, that would answer your question was the very first one, the January-February issue, the 411 on ultrasonics.
Mhm.
And it's a comparative between piezo and magneto. And then then another issue deals with inquiring minds want to know. And then again, asking those questions about, well, wait a minute, when I actually use the piezo, how am I using it differently from using the magneto? And so that I can ensure patient comfort. I can ensure that it's working well, that I'm doing the procedure properly. So shout out to Endeavor for the interest and for the whole community for the interest in supporting these articles.
I think it's important that we go back to those basics on how these instruments work and
Mm.
how those things impact our patient comfort and our efficacy. So tell us about frequency. You mentioned frequency. What does it do?
Okay, Mr. Physics, you're on.
Well, first, the ultrasonic frequency range typically goes from 18 kilohertz up to about 50 kilohertz in dental applications. The frequency basically is how often the tip moves back and forth per second. The amplitude or the distance that tip moves back and forth is what we call sweep. And so, to give you a comparison, a typical ultrasonic tip would have a sweep about 3 thousandths of an inch, which is the thickness of a business card.
So I want that to sink in for just a second for all the listeners, because I'll tell you,
Yeah.
here's the one thing is that I think that we sometimes think, oh, the ultrasonic, whether it's piezo or magneto, I'll just stick the tip subgingivally and I'll swirl it around, and there's like some magic that happens, and poof, the biofilm's gone, calculus jumps off, and and I think that we have to realize that we're dealing with a very fine instrument, medical instrument, and that when we do those subgingivally, of course, we need to know the root anatomy. We need to know where the concavities are, the furcations, if there are any. And so, as we're looking at that, but when you think about just if you take your business card and you look at it and the thickness of that business card, that's the maximum distance you're going to get, the maximum sweep you're going to get. So, what we're doing is really providing a very fine service for our patients, a very fine and refined service for our patients. It's not oh, this thing squirts water and buzzes. I'm just going to stick it in and swirl it around. And we're professionals. We're medical professionals. We are not technicians, as you said earlier, Jess. It's not that somebody's telling us do this, then turn this on. We have to think it through. And yes, do we think it through very rapidly? Of course we do, because we've been well educated, and we do make these split second decisions as we're working. And we do that to accommodate our patient comfort, their safety, and also the efficacy of how we interact with the instruments.
And we have continuing education and we listen to podcasts to be reminded.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
To be reminded that the things that we have in our hands are medical devices that have nuances and
Yes.
that need critical thinking to
Yes.
be effective.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That critical thinking part is so important. Absolutely important.
That's so reassuring because I mean, I have patients say, "Oh, that power washer is so loud and this and that," right? And being able to kind of like tie it back and understand that this is a medical device, that we are using it with a trained, licensed professional. It goes a really long way. Now, I want to be able to kind of flip that on its head, and I want to learn a little bit more about like the tipware because I know that most of us do temping, most of us work in different offices.
Mm.
Most of us
Hmm.
are fighting with our office coordinator slash manager slash assistant who's in charge of the order, and they're asking, "Why do you need more tips?" And then you have to recognize, well, they're worn out. You know what I mean? Like, would a dentist use a bird that's worn out? Help. And so, how important is tipware, and what's impacted if it is if the if I have a worn out instrument?
That's a great question. Let me address that by first talking about the similarities between the two technologies, piezo and magneto. They both use as a primary means of removing calculus mechanical motion. Now you hear some stories about, well, it's elliptical or it's linear. It isn't as important whether it's elliptical or linear. It's important the angle that motion has relative to the axis of the tip. That's really the adaptation then that the clinician, so it's clinician controlled. But the question then, what happens when a tip wears? Well, we know that when tips wear, and we're talking about traditional tips, that their sweep decreases as much as 25% with only 1 millimeter of tip loss.
Isn't that amazing? I mean, it's like 1 millimeter of tip loss, and your distance, your sweep distance is like 25%. Poof, it's like gone. And at 50%, 2 millimeters of wear, it's like 50% of your sweep is gone. So here you're thinking that this instrument is doing the work for you, and it may not be.
Uh-huh.
So the question then you asked, I think, was how much sweep do I need to actually remove calculus? So as the
Yeah.
tip wears, how is this going to impact that? Picture a space shuttle. A space shuttle is sitting on the launch pad. The rockets fire, but nothing moves yet.
Mm.
Mm.
Slowly, it starts to lift off. Well, it can't lift off the launch pad until the force from the rockets equals the weight or the mass of the shuttle. To for the analogy in cleaning calculus, the mechanical energy in the tip has to be equal or greater than the fracture potential of the calculus. So we know that tenacious calculus is harder, so that means it's going to take a slightly higher level of sweep. And as a tip wears, if that sweep decreases, we no longer have enough energy to lift that shuttle off the launch pad. And what happens? We typically burnish the
Mhm.
calculus rather than remove it.
And that's the thing, is that from a clinical standpoint, a couple of things are going on. You've got what I call the triple threat in that case, is that the threat to the patient, as Rich just mentioned, is that you're going to burnish calculus. And so the procedure that they think they're paying for
Isn't
actually
getting
is not
done.
able to be accomplished. The threat to the clinician, what do we do first thing? Goes back to our hand instrumentation days and our psychomotor development from hand instrumentation, is that we grip harder, we press harder. And so the risk for carpal tunnel and wrist issues. And then there's also an ethical part as a clinician, because you're like, this, why isn't this thing removing the calculus? And here's the third thing for the practice. There's a threat to the practice related to, is this part fall under, like part of OSHA, that
Mhm.
M the provider, is the practice owner, are they providing instruments that are safe for me to use? And then also, is there an element of, I would say, I don't know if I'm, not a legal expert, but, thinking about, does this rise to the level of fraud? Because then I just submitted a third party claim to an insurance company, and the instrument did not have the ability to remove the calculus because of the wear of that instrument. What liability does the practice have? So there's a triple threat with the wear. Good news is there are instruments now available that maintain performance up to 3 millimeters. So that's an awesome thing. But I think, Jay, back to your point again, is that, if your patient is saying, gee, this, I don't want that thing that hurt it, like it's sensitive, it hurts, whatever. First thing, if let's say, for example, if I'm using a piezo. And so in our market, piezos it's hot right now. Everybody's talking about piezo, piezo, piezo. So, but you should not be using it as if it were a magneto, like a cavatron. You just, because and it's the tilt against the tooth. So if I'm tilting too much, With my piezo, I'm going to start to roll onto the back, and that's when they hear that loud sound. And when they hear the
Mm.
loud sound, they equate that to, oh, he's going to hurt me, or this is going to be too sensitive. And so it's something as simple as literally on your fulcrum finger, wherever it is, whether you're intraoral or extraoral, it's something as simple as closing that tilt against the tooth so that you're using the lateral surface of the piezo. So it's these like nuances.
And
So
what degree would you have against the tooth surface, Noel? What is the
so
appropriate degree for the
yeah.
piezo?
So for piezo, it would be 0 to 5, and for
Mm.
magneto, it's, what's it, 5
10
to
to
15?
5
Mhm.
to 15.
5 to
Actually,
15.
you can go to the face and the back on magneto as
Right.
well.
Yeah.
But typically, you would use about uh, a 15-degree angle or tilt.
Right. So one of the things I want to reference too is an RDH magazine in the April-May issue. The article that we wrote is "Inquiring Minds Want to Know," and Mr. and Mrs. Ultrasonics answers your questions. And this was one of the questions. And we, through the years of doing CE courses, I've collected questions and I've just accumulated them. And one of them said, "I'm new to piezo. Why is my piezo scaling so loud?" So the article deals specifically with that in a very practical way.
Because we want to be able to use these medical devices in ways that are appropriate and effective.
Absolutely.
And I think what I would like to know is what are some three, like, give us three things that you think that if a clinician were doing it more effectively, it could change their ultrasonic usage life. Like, in my mind, I'm thinking, how often am I changing my power setting? How often am
Right.
I, how often am I looking at that angulation? I'm thinking about my own clinical work and going,
Mhm.
wow, I
Mhm.
could really improve.
Mhm. So I think we start with, and it always goes back to, what device did you first learn ultrasonic scaling in school? Because that's where we're getting that embedded psychomotor aspect to it. And so if you first learned on piezo, that's where you start. If you first learn on magneto, but it's when we start to switch. And, Dave, I think mentioned, perhaps it was, before we started talking about, or maybe it was part of this episode, talking about the guest hygienist. So the
Mhm.
temp hygienist.
Mhm.
And you may walk into a situation where you don't know what you're going to have to work with, or as some guest hygienists do, they're bringing their own equipment because they don't want to be, like, stuck high and dry. But that's a whole nother episode for you guys to deal with and talk about. But back to your question, Jess. The very first thing is that thinking about, okay, I need to identify which technology I'm using. So, let's say that I'm using piezo. We'll go with piezo. Let's say I'm using piezo. So then the next thing is that as I apply that to the tooth, that what is the tilt or the angulation against the tooth, knowing that I needed to have a more closed tilt against the tooth than if I were using magneto. The next thing I would take a look at is the actual adaptation and so that was the angulation. So the adaptation then is like, okay, at piezo, and then just keeping in mind, I only want to use the lateral surfaces. I don't want to use the back. I don't want to use the face. So I actually, when I first started, I first learned on magneto. And then when I worked for Acteon, they make a piezo. So I was director of education. So, I'm really had to make sure I had my piezo technique dialed in. So what that meant for me as the clinician is that I literally had to, in my head, I didn't say it in my out loud voice. In my head, I kept saying lateral surface, lateral surface, just like a
Mhm.
hand instrument, lateral surface. And boy, was it hard for me to break that
Mm.
because it was just so automatic because I learned on magneto.
Mm.
So it goes back to what is the tilt or the angulation? What is the adaptation? And I think having then we take a look at the power setting and then saying, am I using the appropriate power setting for the clinical case as the patient presents? And here's something that I want people to kind of really remember or think about with this power setting. If it doesn't seem like it's working, the tendency is to press harder. But if it doesn't seem like it's working, regardless of which technology it is, think about, is my tip worn?
Mhm.
Mhm.
And it might be something as simple as that the tip may be worn and
Or
not
am I
able.
not using the right power setting? Am I at a really low power setting? Trying to get
Mhm,
off of this tenacious piece of calculus, and I'm not getting that lift in
mhm,
the aircraft. I'm not getting
yeah,
that shift of energy.
mhm, yeah.
I'm curious about, we were talking about angulation. We're talking about how to be effective at removing calculus. Rich, can you tell me your feelings about tapping? is
That's a good question. Yeah.
because
Yeah,
I, as an educator at Rich,
mhm.
I have been known to say tap, 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 sweep,
Sweep, sweep,
sweep,
sweep.
sweep, sweep, tap, tap,
Yeah.
tap, keep it short, keep it, and be intentional. But I am curious from a engineer standpoint, do I need to change?
From a physics point of view, tapping doesn't make total sense. You're cleaning most effectively when the tip is in contact with the calculus. If you're removing intentionally and then tapping it, your contact time is reduced significantly. Uh, there is no clinical evidence that I could see in refereed journals of the effectiveness of the tapping technique. There are some manufacturers who teach that, and it seems to be effective to a degree, but I don't think it's a physical phenomenon that's better than the traditional method of holding the tip against the calculus. Because we just talked about the tilt, and so it's similar to that. If you're tapping, you're not controlling that tilt angle as much. It's one more thing you have to be concerned with.
So what I'm hearing you say is slow down to speed up.
Yes.
Mhm.
So cute. Yes,
Yeah.
you gotta be really intentional with those tips to place it on the calculus. And then what would you recommend our stroke length when we are working? What would you recommend that length to be? I often watch clinicians scale, and I'm seeing a variety of stroke length, and I would love to know from Mr. and Mrs. Ultrasonics what you think would be the most appropriate stroke length.
So I would say precision is a key. And in precision, that means it's going to be a shorter stroke length than a long sweeping kind of. And it goes back to the physics because what you're trying to do is have that energy captured into the calculus in order to fracture it. So if you're using like these big sweeping type of motion that subgingerally, supergent, whatever, you just have to keep in mind that even at high power, that the tip itself is only moving the thickness of a business card. So you know, I think at one point we thought, oh, gee, well, ultrasonics is just so much easier than hand instrumentation. And I would say it requires the same precision, the same knowledge, the same information of root anatomy, and knowing where you are and what you're doing. So I would say a shorter stroke length, staying in contact with the tooth or with the calculus, so that that energy transfer is such that it will build up and fracture the calculus off.
If I could add one thing too, there's another technique that of removing calculus that the sweeping motion would apply to, and that is instead of fracturing the calculus, you're trying to break the bond between the enamel and the calculus. Now
And
the risk,
enamel's porous.
yeah,
So
well,
that's
Yeah.
the risk is that you're going to burnish the calculus if you try to do
Mhm.
that too much. Um, so the best method again is to use the fracture potential, which means that angulation. Uh, And when a tip gets worn, what's the remedy? A lot of people said, "Well, I'll just turn the power up."
Mm.
But guess what? When the tip wears, it changes other characteristics of the insert as well, and that means it cannot generate as much power as when it was new. So turning the power up doesn't necessarily increase your sweep at all.
Right.
And so it's an illusion. So you tend then to press harder, turn the power up, and two things happen. The clinician gets more tired and the patient suffers more distress.
But just let me go back to that power and then like when we change the power knob on our units again, let's compare magneto and piezo on that. Is that so when piezo came out like 1972-ish, Sadillac was the company that introduced that into the marketplace. And so they're now known as Action. And so one of the things I do like about their system is that they have color coded tips, meaning if there's a ring around the tip and then you match it to the power setting. So it's like there's no guessing. It's like, I know whether it's a low power tip or a high power tip. Absolutely no guessing on that. With Magneto, we don't have necessarily a color coded tip, but there are more tips, more inserts rather, that are being developed in the marketplace that you can use on any power setting, whether it's low, medium, or high. And so that's quite a relief to know that we've got some of those that are in the marketplace because we're just doing so much all at the same time. And it's not that we might want to make it easy, we want to make it easier for us
We
to
we
because we're
we
doing
wanna
so
be able
much.
to not have to change the tip and the power setting, but if I'm
Uh-huh.
using a tip that I can use on low to high, and I'm not being as effective and my angulation is correct and
Mhm.
my stroke is very short and I'm being very intentional with the topography of the route and
Yep.
it's still not working, I wanna just be able to reach over and tap, 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 increase that power, and be more effective. When I'm increasing power, am I increasing frequency and amplitude, Rich?
No. The power control is strictly increasing the amplitude, the sweep. The frequency is fixed on all piezos
Hmm.
and almost all the magnetos out there now. There are no, even if it's a manually tuned system, you would simply tune it to the optimum frequency for your insert, and then you wouldn't touch that again. So in either case, changing the power only affects the amplitude.
And
Right.
with our business card analogy,
Mhm.
how do you marry those two ideas, the amplitude and the business card? Am I getting more business cards?
The thickness, so it's the
The
thickness of the
thickness?
business card. So when you're on high, then you're the thickness of a business card. If you're on low, think about that as being like not even the thickness of a business,
It's
meaning
about
much
one
thinner,
third.
one third the thickness of a business card. So so I guess for us, as clinicians, is really thinking about how that distance of that sweep that it really requires precision. It requires overlapping strokes. It is not a stick it in and swirl it around kind of thing that we're going after.
There are tips, though, that have sweeps that are slightly larger than the business card analogy. They're the power tips. A triple bend, for example, would probably be a little bit more than a
Mhm.
business card. It would never be double a business card, but might be slightly more. And there would be tips that have less than a business card. But we use that as a general, just to give you a perspective of what that might look like.
That's amazing. That's such a good reminder because I mean I've been known to be caught up in the case and I'm just stepping on this pedal like a Flintstone and trying to increase the power, trying to get power through it. You know what I mean? But it's such a good point to kind of slow down, maybe take a deep breath or
Mhm.
two,
Mhm.
reevaluate your ergonomics, your shoulders dropping and replacing
Mhm.
tips and just
Yes.
checking your inventory. And speaking of tips, I'm asking for a pro tip here, right? Because I also work in two offices and one of them has a piezo. But what pro tips do you have as far as, you know, over tightening the piezo tips or not fast enough? Because I have an assistant, they try so hard to set it up for me, and the doctor's like, don't over tighten them because you'll kill it, right? And so oftentimes they under tie them, and sometimes I turn it on without checking because I'm in a hurry, and the tip starts like rotating around. But what pro tip do you have about those piezo tips?
Yeah, so when you're using the wrench, and there are some that actually, in the past have had like a click to it, and
Mhm.
I love that one particular wrench, but I think that most of the wrenches that are out there, they either are like a little medical metal device or it might be a plastic device that you put over the tip, and I guess the word is snug. It should just
Yeah,
when
they
if
slip when they hit the torque.
yeah, but some of those, not all the manufacturers have that type. So, so the bottom line is it snug? Does it fit snugly? Here's something, and talk about a pro tip is that, and related to piezo. So there are two types of piezos. And so there one that uses what's called S threads, the other uses E threads. So what's the difference? So S threads came out of Sadillac. They were the inventors, the originators of piezo, and so that's why the S mean was from Sadillac, and they have a particular thread pitch to them. Then EMS came on the scene. EMS also has threads, but the pitch on their threads is slightly different. They are not interchangeable. So that would be one pro tip. You should not be trying to use an S thread tip on an E type of handpiece or vice versa. And that's where your professional sales representative comes in, is really your ally to say, okay, but I think do clinicians even know to say, oh, is this an S thread or an E thread? Maybe, maybe not, but that would definitely be a pro tip on it. And then just to make sure that it's a snug fit, because Rich, I know you wanted to talk about the energy transfer from the handpiece to the threads. If it's not snug,
It's not
forget about it.
working.
Now,
Right.
there is one thing that used to be it's not a standard, but the E threads used to have four flats on them.
You mean the
It's
tip
the
itself?
tip itself
Yeah.
had 4
Mhm.
flats. If it had 4 flats, you knew it was an E thread. If it had 2 flats, you knew it was an S thread. That's not totally universal. Some people may have violated that, but as a general rule, I think that still applies. But if you try to interchange the thread, you're going to damage your handpiece for sure.
And you're
So
not going to be effective.
it
Oh, it won't
right,
work.
right. It won't work.
You'll never get it on,
Yeah,
either one.
right. But think about that. Now you're going to the practice owner or to the doctor and saying, "Ugh, I need a new handpiece."
Yeah.
You're looking at a couple
Mhm.
$100. I
Yeah.
mean, so that would not be a message that would be received well.
And one of the challenges, well, we said if you don't tighten a piezo thread, you're not going to transfer the energy. In When a piezo thread wears, and by the way, the same materials are used for piezo tips as magneto tips, so they're going to wear approximately at the same rates. The only exception to that is for implant tips are made of titanium.
Mm.
Titanium wears 33% faster than all the other tips. But then you're using much lighter pressures, so there's a trade-off. One of the challenges with any technology when the tips wear, not only do you lose the sweep, but you also lose energy transfer efficiency.
Which you
And
need to pop it off.
yeah,
Right, exactly.
exactly. So things are decreasing much faster all the way around. And so the remedy is replace your tips more often. When you get to manufacturers say when you get to 1 millimeter, you should reorder. That really should be a change point, not a reorder point. 25% loss in efficiency is significant.
Yes. Yes.
So
And
can you
we'll feel
imagine
it.
back to the medical professional analogy in some ways? So a couple weeks ago, I had an outpatient minor surgical procedure, and I was thinking about this. And I'm thinking, now, if the surgeon had come to me and said, "Noel, I'm going to do this procedure. It's been done many, many times. It's very routine to have this done, and we know that we'll have a good outcome." Blah blah. And then if the next sentence was, "And the instruments I'm going to be using, that it'll be like 25% less effective. Is it okay if I go ahead and use that? Or by the way, I might have to use the one that's 50% worn. So is it okay if we start the procedure?" And the answer is no, 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 and no. Okay, so as a patient, would I know that unless I had been informed?
No.
No, I wouldn't know that. And then, is it going to be documented in my medical record of, "Oh, we use the 50% less effective"? No, that probably wouldn't be in there. So, I think we need to be very mindful of the instruments that we are using and not expect them to do more than they were designed to do.
And be mindful that the people who are using these instruments should be professionals. And we
Oh,
appreciate,
absolutely. Yeah.
yes, we appreciate the pro tips from the Paschkes and
Thank you.
that are reminding us that these are medical devices and we are medical professionals.
Mhm.
And this is a PSA to all patients, all clinicians, that if you are in a situation where you are going to have a minor medical procedure, i.e., your teeth cleaned, you ask questions. Ask if the provider is someone who holds a license. Ask if the provider is someone who is being intentional and understanding how their position has an ethical responsibility to you as a patient. So thank you, Paschkes, for elevating our profession, and we will see you on our next episode.
Lovely. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
That's a wrap on today's episode of A Tale of Two Hygienists podcast. If this conversation made you feel seen, inspired, or even just a little fired up, share it with a fellow hygienist or fellow dental professional. Share it with your neighbors, your friends. Share it with everyone. That is how this community grows.
Make sure you subscribe, leave us a review, and connect with us on social media so that we can keep on going with this conversation. Remember, your career, your voice, and your story matter here. We're David.
And Jessica,
And until next time.
keep learning, keep laughing, and keep showing up for yourself and for each other.
This has been a production of Endeavor Business Media, a division of Endeavor B2B.